All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Millennials Are Old podcast. And you know what, Brian? I didn't have an idea for this episode. I've been thinking for a week now since we last recorded. I've just been frantically just trying to come up with an idea for this episode. And I'm fucking lost for words. I don't even know what to say.
Yeah, I gotta say, this is really the audience at home that's not listening. This is just a peek behind the curtains of the type of tension and frustration between Taylor and I that it's really been interfering with our partnership. You know what happens when you get big egos in a room together?
Yeah. I mean, the thing I keep thinking, right, is that like this last week, just the style I've been living my life will lead to my death in a style that I would not like to go through. I just don't want to go through that. You know what I mean?
So your death style is going to be determined by your lifestyle?
I mean, that's possible, but to be honest, I think I can get out of this rut pretty easily.
Because, like, that's pretty fucking poetic. Like, if you just thought of that now, like, off the dome, that's crazy.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I think after this episode, I just need to disappear for a little bit.
It's been a long time coming, really. You've been really agitated. You've been blowing up.
Yeah. I mean, that's just the reality. It's sad, but true. All right. That's enough Metallica
What are we
references.
talking about?
Yeah. All right, with enough Metallica references out of the way, let's get into our episode for this week. The album Saint Anger, the infamous album Saint Anger by Metallica. Now, Brian, this was my choice for this week's episode. What did you know about Saint Anger before I recommended it?
That people said it was bad, that the drums on it sounded weird, that it was made about, them going to band therapy or whatever. Very little. And the thing is, I've been a Metallica fan since about like sixth grade, which is like when I got into rock music and music in general. Because until I got into punk in like maybe eighth grade, I was just a classic rock nerd. Just if a band was on t-shirts, I listened to it. And Metallica were one of those bands. My dad and I would bond over them. Really liked the classic albums. Kind of, as I got older, didn't really like the Black Album. Didn't like Load Reload. Did not listen to Saint Anger. Because while I was never I've never been a massive Metallica fan, I really love those classic albums. And I was like, that's enough. I don't need to listen to the bad albums. And since I already didn't like, the 90s stuff, I was like, I'll just leave Saint Anger alone. I don't need to hear it. And that's about where I was at for a long time. Probably until about 2 weeks ago. Then I know you'd been wanting to do Saint Anger for a long time. And it just so happened that the last several weeks I've been listening to a lot of like crossover and a lot of 80s thrash. So I was revisiting all those classic Metallica albums, the first four. So it kind of seemed like a good time that when you brought it up, I was like, oh yeah, I'm kind of in a good headspace for that. I guess it's time to do it, dive into Saint Anger. But that's what I knew about it, that people said it was bad and that it was their therapy album or whatever.
Yes. And you know what? We'll definitely get into all that because there's definite truths to all those things that you stated. But first, let's get into some historical details here. So this album was released on June 5th of 2003. It was actually meant to be released 5 days later, but to get through to the various pirators, it was shipped just a little bit early just to get the jump start on the pirators. And trust me, we will get into Napster and P2P sharing very shortly because it is very notable to this album in this period of time for Metallica.
Well, and this period of time that we're speaking from, I think one of the interesting things about this period is that's one of the things that people associate with this album that made Metallica lame for a long time. Lars being a rich asshole about file sharing and about music on the internet and not compensated for it. What we now know, looking back, is he was pretty much correct, like almost completely. And I really am not sure if I think that he was so angry about the money as he was about like the ownership of like his art. And I think now it's pretty hard to look at the streaming climate and things that, we are actually talking about this in the middle of the writers and actors strike, which I think is relevant because it relates to streaming. But that was the thing that for decades, like that made Metallica not cool. And that was what people tied to this album.
Yes, and also you're talking about the sort of ownership of your art, which I feel like that was like 95% of Lars's intentions with that. And we'll get into why I think that. But, the thing is, you're talking about copyright and everything. I mean, this current writers and actors strike going on now, which I believe is the very first actors and writers strike since like the 60s. So This is a pretty unprecedented time in entertainment. It coincides with, and I think you were mentioning it too, like one of the big tipping points that made the strike happen was studios are literally paying people pennies to license their likeness for AI art for eternity.
And guess what? That all starts with Napster. I'm sorry, but that all starts with file sharing. Like it does.
100%.
What did you pay for this album and documentary anyways, Taylor?
I paid the full sticker price that was listed on Amazon for this.
Attaboy.
I did. I did not use any P2P sharing sites at all for any of this. But speaking of things that should not be spoken of, this album does have a parental advisory sticker, which makes sense. There's certainly a couple swears on this album.
In retrospect, it kind of is almost like not. It's like a family record.
Yeah, borderline.
Very nice, kind of lyrically.
And once again, this album was performed by Metallica, consisting of James Hetfield on lead guitar, as always, Kirk Hammett on guitar and backing vocals, and he's been on, I think, every single release except for Kill 'Em All. And then Lars Ulrich, who's also an original member, he's been on all the releases. And you would think Jason Newsted, but no. Jason Newsted quit just before the recording of this album, and producer Bob Rock filled in on bass for the entirety of the record. It is often misattributed as well that Robert Trujillo played on this record. He did not.
This would have been great if he had been with them for this.
Agreed.
Because this is pretty much the only Metallica album where his bass style, that very funky, plucky, finger-plucking, suicidal tendencies style, would have been great. Would have been perfect.
Yeah, and as we know, infamously, Metallica has never really appreciated the bass in their music. But interestingly enough, Metallica's always had really good fucking bassists in it. They had fucking Cliff, they had Jason and Robert, who are all like top tier bassists.
Yeah, all top tier, but also like Cliff, especially. I mean, I don't want to discount Newsted at all. Cliff Burton, direct descendant of bass players stylistically, like Phil Lynott and Geddy Lee. Like a very musical, very melodic bass player.
For sure. Rest in peace. Friend of the pod, although he died before we were even born. Still friend of the pod.
Friend of the pod, Cliff Burton.
This album was the last album released by Elektra Records by Metallica. They would later go on to be on Warner Brothers. And then for their last two albums, they have been... Actually, interestingly enough, Metallica are now an independent band. They have released their last two albums on their own record label, Blackened Records. But this was the last album released by Elektra.
You listened to either of those last two?
I've only listened to Hardwired to Self-Destruct, the song. That's it. I've not listened to any other songs. By the way, Brian, we're going to talk about a little bit about how this album kind of killed Metallica in popular music in a lot of ways. Did you know Metallica came out with an album this fucking year?
Yeah, 72 Seasons. So I'm going to tell you straight up, I've not listened to 72 Seasons. I've not listened to Death Magnetic. I've not listened to Hardwired. But the reason is pretty much because whenever they come out, people say, oh, Metallica are good again. And I'm like, yeah, probably. But I haven't listened to any of them. That's what it's called, right? 72 Seasons?
Yes.
72 flavors?
It's double as good as Baskin Robbins, almost a little bit more than that. And once again, this album was produced by Bob Rock, who also played bass on this album. Now, this was also the last album by Metallica produced by Bob Rock. He also produced the Black Album, Load, and Reload. So he was partially responsible at the very bare minimum, for Metallica's most successful chart-topping period. The thing was obviously you know about Metallica's history, but 80s very much the rise, 90s was their peak of popularity, and then we'll get into why, but the 2000s were very much the nadir of their critical and commercial success, I would say, by quite a bit.
But yeah, absolutely. But even more than just nadir, it's also kind of like a Lost in the Woods period for them.
It is, very much so. Like, their one album that people kind of even give moderate credit for is Death Magnetic, but to be honest, that's not a great album. I don't like Death Magnetic.
I haven't even listened to it.
It's very boring, and it's not mixed very well, which is a problem Metallica's had pretty consistently throughout their careers, and a lot of the records don't sound the best.
That's a time-honored tradition of thrash, though.
That is true, yeah. And then speaking of things not being mixed very well, this album is 75 minutes and 4 seconds long. Now, you may think, that's not the longest Metallica album. I can imagine listening to 75 minutes of Metallica. Wait until we get into why this album is 75 minutes long, because even though I will spoil my opinions, I do like this album. There is no fucking reason this album needs to be 75 minutes long. There is no reason.
I enjoyed this significantly more than I thought I would, and pretty actively enjoyed it. I think there's 5 songs out of the, 11 on here, I think, that I really like. I'm going to say there's only one that I would consider putting on my personal Metallica playlist. Yeah. So 5 tracks out of 11 that I think are pretty damn good. I enjoy listening to them. I think they're good songs. Almost all of them are too long, by a minute at least.
I think there are several songs that are 3 to even 4 minutes. One of them's 4 minutes longer than it needs to be. That's how long these songs are.
Yeah.
Honestly, if every song in this album was cut by anywhere between 1 to 3 minutes, it would be perfect. And just obviously picking which songs need to be cut the most versus which ones need to be cut the least. But yeah, all these songs way too fucking long. And once again, I do like this album. I even like the majority. I think I actually like a couple more songs than you do. You said 5 out of 11. I would say I like probably 7 or 8. But even then, like I said, they're just too fucking long. They're just too long. And then we're definitely going to talk about how this album is extremely polarizing. You either like it or you vehemently hate it. This was a metric where I got 2 completely differing ratings. On Amazon, this album has a 4.4 out of 5. And on Rate Your Music, it has a 1.81 out of 5. So very disparate approvals on both these websites, which I found really interesting because the more research that I did for this album, like, don't get me wrong, this is definitely not anybody's outside of some random contrarians on Reddit's favorite Metallica album. Like, obviously, like I said, I like this album, but I would not say it's my favorite Metallica album. There's certainly better Metallica albums. But the vehement, like, overwhelming hatred that people talk about from fans is just a very, very vocal minority for the most part, it seems like. Most people have songs, like most Metallica fans, have songs this album that they like. Like, it is not a universal hatred from fans.
Well, like, can I say part of what I think that is? When I say that I liked almost half the album, I want to point out that pretty much all of the songs that I would say I don't like are like in the first half. I think those are the long songs. They're also the most jarring. You haven't quite settled into the record. And I kind of think, like, when I was listening to that, when I got a few tracks in and we got to the first track that I really liked, I remember thinking, okay, this is pretty good. But I was also like, this is track 5. And all the 4 tracks before it were pretty long. So I could see being in a bad mood by the time you got here.
Yes, I'll agree with that. So, as we mentioned, there's 11 songs in this album. I would say my favorite songs out of, like, I think I said the 8, I think 5 of them are in the latter half of this album. Like, literally the last 5 songs I like. Like, there's 3 songs I think are not great. Maybe like 2.5, but still. Like, the last 5 songs I like. And I'm glad you also at least seemingly like a little bit the last 5 songs too. I think it's hilarious because we were going back and forth in the chat. And, like, we actually have pretty much the same opinions on each song. It's really funny.
Yeah, I would say so. There's a track that I think you like a lot more than I do in that second half that we'll get to. But otherwise, I think the second half of this is really good. I almost feel like it feels kind of like they wrote and recorded it in sequence. And so the second half of it feels a lot more comfortable and a lot more like aware of what they're trying to be. I have no proof of that.
Well, to be fair, we have a little bit of proof of that because also spoilers, because we're going to get into it. We also watched the documentary Some Kind of Monster, which is about the making of Saint Anger and also this general period of Metallica from the very beginning of 2001 till when the album came out in middle of 2003. And through that documentary, and we'll definitely get into certain parts of the documentary when we get to the track listing, it does show what seemingly is an order. A lot of the tracks on Saint Anger do seem to be made in sequence for the most part.
That's how it sounds to me. It sounds very much like the first half of the album and the second half of the album. It sounds like it was written and recorded in order. And so the second half of the album feels a lot more confident and a lot more clear of what it is.
Yes, very much so. And then speaking of the making of, let's get into some trivia here. So the first fact I have here is in 2001, Metallica rented an old United States Army barracks on the Presidio of San Francisco, which is the northernmost portion of San Francisco. It actually used to be a full-on military barracks, but now there's like housing there and stuff like that, and converted it into a makeshift studio for initial recording. But from May 2002 until April 2003, the album was recorded at a new studio in San Rafael, California, known as HQ. Now, interestingly enough, just like with Robert Trujillo being a mainstay after this album came out, the HQ is also a mainstay. They have recorded every single album, including this one, in the HQ since Saint Anger came out. So I think that's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, clearly, like, even though this is considered a bad period for them, clearly they stumbled on something here that worked for them. Part of this change was good for them, at least internally, they felt.
Yes, and I think once we get to the documentary, that'll explain why this is, even though a very tumultuous time in Metallica's history, this was really the make it or break it time, and I think they made it, and they've stayed it. I think they've done a pretty good job of staying stable since this album came out. Like, no lineup changes, everybody seems to be mostly pretty chill, like, James has been almost completely sober, like, it's just, you know, I think I was watching a video, because I've watched a lot of videos, a lot of retrospectives, a lot of history, a lot of people's opinions about this album, and about the making of it, and the main thing I keep coming back to is I think this album needed to happen for Metallica. This had to happen, whether you like it or not.
They needed to confront this part of themselves, whether it was going to be successful or people are going to like it or not.
Exactly. And whether you like it or not, whether you hate the songs, whether you hate the production, this album is like essentially the bottom of the barrel, make it or break it. Metallica has to make a piece of art that gets all their feelings out. They need to work it out, come back together as a stronger unit. And I think they did.
Yeah, they literally had to. They would have broken up if they didn't make this album.
Yeah. So like people who hate on this album, if you like Metallica's last couple albums, you have Saint Anger to thank. Like seriously, you really do.
And it's also, this is the beginning of this period that I would say is sort of still going on, although they seem to have stabilized from Death Magnetic onward. This is kind of like, Metallica, you can tell all of them have always had this feeling of this sort of insecurity about their artistic legitimacy. Now that to me seems like if you were Metallica after those first 3 albums, you shouldn't have needed that. In my thoughts, basically from Fade to Black onward, James Hetfield didn't have to prove that he was an artist to anyone.
No, I 100%
but
agree with that.
I think that internally, and especially James and Lars had and still have this feeling that they're like, we want to transcend being a metal band in some way. We want people to know that we're artists. I don't really think anyone doesn't believe that unless they're like an asshole, but that's how they feel. And this is kind of the beginning, I think, or maybe Load and Reload. In fact, I'd say, Load and Reload is something like, no, we're artists. We need to show people that we're making art.
Yeah, and it's interesting because obviously we're going to talk about Kirk a little bit, but Kirk, I think I mentioned to you in the chat, especially in the documentary and just in general throughout most of Metallica's history, Kirk is like the child of fighting parents who are on the verge of divorce. He's just like, guys, can we all just get along? Like that is Kirk.
One
is
of
like
the funniest lines
here
in this movie is like when Lars and James are arguing, and then Kirk soft-spoken says, "Guys, why don't we just go in there and hammer it out instead of hammering out on each other?" And it's like, oh,
Kirk is very wholesome. I like Kirk a lot. He seems like a cool guy,
sweetheart.
And also, you're talking about how both Lars and James want to be seen as artists. I think it's interesting that it comes from 2 completely different worldviews because James, he grew up in an unstable household. His parents got divorced when he was a kid. His mom died when he was 16 years old. And in fact, James almost died when he was a kid too because his parents were devout, quote unquote, Christian scientists. Which is such a fucking oxymoron.
He wrote some really harrowing songs about that time of his life.
The God That Failed.
The God That Failed. Yep. So I mostly think the Black Album is really boring, but that is an amazing song.
Honestly, I think the Black Album slaps. I think it's got some great bangers on it.
I think Sad But True and The God That Failed are 2 of the best Metallica songs.
Okay, that's what I was mentioning. I love Sad But True. But basically, you got to think about this, is that James' entire immediate family has been dead for decades. Because his mom died, his brother died, I think when Load came out, and his dad's been dead for quite a few years now, too. So, basically, his entire, childhood was destroyed. He grew up, kind of isolated. And, they talk about it on the writing of certain songs. He didn't really come to his own and really, confront his own childhood and his own feelings of insecurity up until he had to go to rehab when he was almost fucking 40 years old. And they talk about it in the documentary. So there's that insecurity there of being trying to seen as an artist and a worthy human being. And Lars gets that perspective because, Lars grew up a rich kid. He grew up a rich kid. His grandfather was a world-class athlete, tennis player, and his dad was also a world-class tennis player. Lars grew up and I looked this up, Lars grew up in the richest town in Denmark. That's not a joke. He grew up in a place where the royalty of Denmark lived. His childhood friend was Nana Cherry. He collects art as a hobby. He is a fancy lad rich kid.
Yeah, which is fine. I don't want to dunk on him too hard for that, but it's important to keep in mind that he is a little like Lord Fauntleroy, and he collects fine art, and he likes to look at it. He's like a sensitive guy who's like, what do you think of this art? What do you think of this? How does this make you feel?
Yeah, and that's the thing, though, right? Is he wants to be seen as an artist because, that's just what, Fauntleroy fancy lads do.
Yeah.
They're artistes. They don't do metal. They make art. You know what I mean? I think he wants to be seen as an artist in that way, which is why in his, spare time, when he's not learning how to be the best drummer in the world, he's collecting art. Which, even though people do shit on Lars, you gotta be honest, he fits Metallica just fine.
Yeah, lots of people are rich kids. So if I was born into a rich family, what would I disown it? Well, I'm going to say it. Lars, with the exception of one person who is in one scene who we'll get to, Lars is the biggest asshole. He's still pretty sympathetic in Some Kind of Monster for the most part, but he's the biggest dickhead of the main cast.
And boy, I can't wait till we get to the biggest asshole in that documentary because we both know exactly who the fuck it is.
The big gaping asshole.
And speaking of people who aren't assholes, the next trivia fact I have here is, once again, guitarist Kirk Hammett commented on the lack of guitar solos on Saint Anger, a departure from Metallica. He says, quote, "We wanted to preserve the sound of all 4 of us in a room just jamming. We tried to put guitar solos on, but we kept on running into this problem. It really sounded like an afterthought," unquote. Hammett said that he was happy with the final product. That's the thing, though, is that, we love Kirk, but this is the most useless he's ever been on a Metallica album. Because, a lot of his purpose is making solos on Metallica albums.
He's the lead guitarist.
And I bet he probably likes the final product because when they play the songs live, he doesn't have to put that much effort into
Well, yeah, and then he gets to do solos live when they do them now.
That is true, yes. He does fill those in, and honestly, they fit the song just fine.
My impression of that quote you just read after seeing Some Kind of Monster is that Kirk is not as happy, maybe, with that as he was saying. To me, it doesn't make sense to say that they wanted to capture a band jamming and not have solos. It seems like that is an environment where solos would have come about pretty naturally.
I wish there were more solos on this album, but we'll get into why there aren't solos on this album, because I think they were trying to create a particular sound. And then speaking of particular sounds, the next factlet I have here is Lars Ulrich recorded his drums without using the snares on his snare drum, resulting in a drum tone with far more quote-unquote ring than is usual in rock. Ulrich said, quote, "One day I forgot to turn the snare on because I wasn't thinking about this stuff. At the playbacks, I decided I was really liking what I was hearing. It had a different ambience. It sang back to me in a beautiful way," unquote. Now, this has been probably the single most maligned thing about this album is Lars's snare drum. And to be fair, I will give the detractors credit. It does very much overpower a lot of the songs on this album. But you know what? I think you and I both agree. I fucking love the snare sound.
I like it. It's cool. I like throwing it. And I'm not trying to be a contrarian. I'm not. It's this clingy kind of industrial noise, but I think it does overpower a lot of the songs. But it does also work with what the songs are. I think one of the things, because I had listened for fun, even though I'd never listened to this album, to those mixes where people would put like the drumming style from this over like Master of Puppets, and I'd laugh like, oh, and listen to it for a minute or two and be like, that sounds awful. The thing is that these songs aren't the songs on Master of Puppets. They aren't the songs on Kill 'Em All. Those songs weren't written to have these kinds of drums. These songs were.
Yeah, exactly. It would be like putting, hey, what if we put Ringo's drums on a Cannibal Corpse song? It's like, well, that's not meant to be what it's for.
Yeah, it was never meant to go together.
The next fact I have here is 2004, Metallica won the award for Best Metal Performance for the title track, of course, Saint Anger. Now, I think it's interesting, too, because Saint Anger, the title track, I think we would both agree is definitely not the best song in this album.
I think it's one of the worst songs on the album.
And I think that's interesting because the Grammys have just forever, they will never, in metal's establishment, ever get over the fact that the very first Best Metal Performance went to Jethro Tull. And ever since then, they'll be like, metal fans, please love us. We put a Metallica album on here and we gave them the Best Metal Performance.
Also, like, Jethro Tull was up against, was it the music video for One, right? That was the performance?
Yes, I believe
this
it was.
This amazing song.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, arguably one of the best metal videos of all time, still to this day. I mean, the Grammys have always been an embarrassment. No matter what, it doesn't matter. But I do think it's funny that this album is a Grammy Award-winning album. And then speaking of other accolades, Saint Anger was certified double platinum by the Record Industry Association of America, the RIAA, for shipping over 2 million copies in the US, and worldwide it has sold over 6 million copies. So this was not a very poor selling album, and in fact, this is the best-selling Metallica album of the 2000s, which makes sense because the next album was in 2008, and record sales were not nearly as strong as they were in the early 2000s.
Looking at the sales for this album aren't really a good way to gauge the reception for it, because Load and Reload were still pretty well received, so this sold well. A better way to gauge the negative reception for Saint Anger is the sales of their subsequent record.
Well, to be fair, Death Magnetic sold almost as well as this album. I think it sold like 5 million copies, and it is double platinum as well.
I've never listened to a second of Death Magnetic. I forget it exists sometime, to be honest.
I remember listening to it a good amount when it came out, like when I was in high school, and I don't know. I just don't care for it. It's just a big meh for me. It's not bad. It's just a big meh. And also, if you don't like Rick Rubin, you'll hate it because Rick Rubin produced it.
I like Rick Rubin, fine.
Fair enough, I do too.
He's kind of a savant.
All right, and then speaking of, we talked about this album so much, let's get into the track listing. And also, I think we should implement a little bit of the documentary, the making of, when talking about, because a lot of the songs on this album are actually detailed fairly extensively in the documentary as well, which once again is Some Kind of Monster. And then also, before we get started on that, the preamble to the preamble I just had there, I think we need to talk a little bit about the song I Disappear, which I feel like is almost kind of a prequel to this album a little bit. So we were talking about Napster earlier. So the reason that Napster was taken down eventually started with Metallica, started with Lars, and started with the song I Disappear. I Disappear was a song released in around, I think, the middle of 2000. It was released for the Mission Impossible 2 soundtrack, which one of my friends described as the worst Mission Impossible movie. Although, not only does it have a Metallica song on it, it also has a Limp Bizkit song on it, so it can't be that bad. But the reason that this got started was Lars, before the song came out and before the soundtrack came out, was told by somebody, I'm not even entirely sure, but was informed of the fact that the demo for the song I Disappear was released on Napster. Now, the demo had never been released publicly. So how the fuck did this get on Napster? Nobody knows to this day how it ended up on Napster, but Lars was very fucking mad about it. I would say, as we mentioned earlier, probably more artistic reasons than for financial reasons.
I'm sure there's financial reasons.
And then speaking of, so Lars's outrage at this led to the court case in the District Court of Northern California, which is also where Metallica have been based in for a very long time. So it makes sense they filed it there. In April 13th, 2000, Metallica filed a lawsuit against Napster. Metallica alleged that Napster was guilty of copyright infringement under the RICO statutes. That's what they use to like prosecute like mobsters and gang members to this day. And R. Kelly too, that's very true.
Friend of the pod, R. Kelly. Free my man.
Exactly, I agree. Just kidding, obviously. It's parody. We do not recommend releasing R. Kelly. He is a danger to society.
Robert, come on the pod.
Yes, please. Actually, that would be pretty fascinating if he came on. He'd call from his like jail
I've
phone.
listened to the leaked interviews he's done with these shitty little YouTube channels. They're fucking boring. He's lost his fucking mind. He's such a sniveling little bitch. And he's like, I'm dying here, man. I'm dying. It's like, yeah, maybe you shouldn't have fucking raped children.
But yeah, so on July 11, 2001, Lars Ulrich read testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee accusing Napster of copyright infringement. So essentially, once again, he went to the Senate in this Northern District of California. They actually did a preliminary ruling in favor of Metallica, saying that Napster had to get rid of all Metallica music within 72 hours of that court injunction. They ended up doing it, and they also ended up banning a bunch of people. Obviously, those people just filed under different accounts, and that was like jerk-off motion, whatever. But this court case led to the downfall of Napster, because Napster closed down only a year after this court case. And as well, this was the very first court case that sort of the floodgates went open for a bunch of other companies suing people. And what I think was a pretty disgusting display of corporate greed on a lot of those people's parts, because some of those people's lives were literally ruined.
Destroyed,
And they didn't target anybody specifically. They just found random people who uploaded songs. Like somebody uploaded like a dozen songs to Napster and they got sued for $2 million. Like insane bullshit.
Well, they were making an example of people.
Exactly. And it obviously tarnished Lars's reputation among metal fans, among Metallica fans, among general music listeners. Lars was a punching bag from everybody, from regular fans to fucking South Park to just everybody made fun of Lars at this point. And although I think in retrospect, outside of the other things that came in the aftermath of this court case, I think 99% he was in the right. I just obviously hate the fact that other people were opportunistically trying to destroy people's lives to make an example. I think that shit sucks, but it's rough. But interestingly enough, actually, Napster is a company that still exists to this day under a different leadership and under a different model. In fact, Napster is now a pay service and a streaming platform. And interestingly enough, is that out of the major streaming services, Napster actually gives the most per streams of any artist.
Maybe I should start using them.
Yeah, I think I was looking it up. So like Spotify gives like 0.001 cent, like whatever, just a pitiful amount of money per stream.
May as well be negative.
But I think Napster puts out like multiple, like 100 times more per stream than Spotify does.
Interesting.
In fact, I think they just beat out Tidal, which Tidal is actually the second place. So honestly, Jay-Z is kind of annoying too, but good on you, Jay-Z, for at least compensating artists better than Spotify. I'll give you that.
Well, all he talks about is his fucking investments these days, so...
That is true. What a phony. No, I'm just kidding. He's making bank.
He's old. He's burned it, whatever.
But we did have to talk about I Disappear because, as I said, it is very much the preamble. The court case is the preamble. And I think it really had a very, sour impression on people by the time this album came out. Because this album was hyped to hell. Everybody was talking about it. The documentary was getting hyped up. Metallica, their first album in 6 years. It was, oh my God, Metallica are back. They're dealing with all this controversy. They're still a big band. They talk about in the documentary how they just had an Icon show, which was MTV's sort of Hall of Fame thing where they have a bunch of people covering their songs and blah, blah, blah. So this album coincided. And also this album came out about, I think it was near the 20th anniversary of Kill 'Em All too. So this was Metallica's essentially 20-year plus run. And in fact, interestingly enough, as of recording, Kill 'Em All just celebrated its 40th anniversary a week ago.
Yeah, I just re-listened to it and the other three after. But yeah, Kill 'Em All fucking perfect. It really does sound like it hasn't aged a day as metal goes.
Oh, no, for sure. 100%. So yeah, this album was very hyped up, and unfortunately, it didn't hit for everybody. And part of the reason why is some of the tracks are not the best. So without further ado, let's finally get into the track listing of Saint Anger. Now, as I mentioned in the opening of this episode, I made a bunch of mentions of various Metallica songs and the lyrics. So the very first song in this album is Frantic. It was the second release single on this album, and the song is very clearly about addiction, about James Hetfield's alcoholism in particular. And it has also one of the most infamous lyrics on this album, which I liked, apparently you didn't, but I liked, is "My lifestyle determines my death style," which is cheesy as fuck. But it's kind of so bad for me, it's good.
I mean, so when you know that it's about that he was really going through some shit with like drinking and things, it's kind of like it makes sense. But the lyrics on most of the first half of this album, they make me feel bad for him. He's trying to be poetic, he's trying to bare his soul, and it's just corny and it's kind of, it's cringy.
It is. There's a lot of lyrics on this album that are really bad. I mean, I enjoy them for how bad they are because, you know, as you know, when we first met, you were definitely the more musically knowledgeable. But there was one genre that I was just definitively more knowledgeable on, which was nu metal. And nu metal was all about kind of cringy, corny guys making songs about their emotions. And that's what this album is.
The thing is, I like the stuff about the emotions. That's not necessarily what makes it like corny for me, but it's like this first half of the album, it feels like these first two songs are the first songs that James wrote experimenting with this worldview. So they're very clunky and he still doesn't really know how to do it.
I totally agree with that. Like, honestly, the lyrics on this song are definitely, I wouldn't say the worst in the album, but it's very clear they're still working on the writing process. In the documentary they show, I think this is the very first song they work on, because in the documentary when they're making it, it is still at the Presidio studio, which, like I said, they were almost never at the Presidio studio.
Right.
So, like, this was very early.
Yeah, those sessions broke down quickly.
They did, yeah. And I also think it's interesting. So they also talk about how this is the first album that was like kind of like a collaborative effort, because for the most part, James did all the lyrics before this album came out. And, you know, for better or worse, I don't think James is like the songwriter of a generation or anything like that. But Metallica songs in general, like the lyrics are good to serviceable.
Can I just respond to that?
Oh, yeah, sure. Go for it.
I think James Hetfield writes some great fucking lyrics, especially for the band he is in. Like, I don't like to say that rock lyrics are like poetry. I hate when people say that because I think it's reductive, and it's usually said by people that don't really read a lot of poetry. So they don't really understand how lyrics and poetry are different. But Hetfield is significantly more literary than probably any of his contemporaries. That's not because he's like an educated guy. I think he just was always interested, you know, he never really liked writing about hell. Not because he was a Christian or whatever. I think he is now, but he wasn't initially in Metallica's salad days, but because he knew a lot of his influences, a lot of the earlier metal bands had, and he thought it was boring. What distracts me about the bad lyrics on this are that I know that Hetfield, by this point, had a voice. The reason these lyrics aren't working are A, because he's collaborating. He's sacrificing his own comfort with being in control of the lyrics to let the other guys feel a little bit more expressive, you know? Which, again, maybe not the best artistic choice for the album, but he had to do it for Metallica to survive. But
as we mentioned earlier, and we will keep mentioning, this album had to happen the way that it happened.
That's a thing I was thinking during Some Kind of Monster, when you see that the other guys are contributing lyrics and you see it make James tense up, it's because I don't think James particularly wanted to write lyrics. He just loved metal music and someone had to write the lyrics. But he has a lyrical voice and it guided Metallica. That's the reason that they're this really angry, vaguely political, very like masculine coded kind of like intelligent band throughout the 80s. And Load Reload, Taylor, if you get a chance, if you listen to Load and Reload, go read some of those lyrics just on paper. That is almost like poetry. It's almost like Tom Waits at times.
I've never been like a gigantic fan of Metallica, but I've always listened to their singles, and at least the singles off of Load and Reload, I like those songs. Those are. Yeah. I was just listening to Unforgiven Part 2 just before we started recording.
I also have to give him credit. I actually don't like any of the Unforgiven songs, but I like that they actually say in there, "And are you unforgiven too?" Like they find a way to make the two part of the lyrics. It's so cool. But so I guess my thing is, there's a few reasons that these lyrics are clunky, especially in these early songs. James is sharing the writing credits because the other guys wanted to have an input. So I feel like he's sacrificing probably better lyrics to let them have a say because he felt like he had to because they were in therapy together, and he's trying to learn to give up some of his control of the band. Secondly, he's trying to write in a new language for him. His old lyrics, I think, are very smart and even like in their own way sensitive, but they're not introspective and they're not vulnerable. They are decidedly not vulnerable. Maybe on Load Reload, kind of, but not like this. They aren't about being sad or about being lonely. They aren't about doubting yourself in that way. And so he's trying to write about that. And what you get in some of the songs on here, particularly Saint Anger, the title track, and for me, these first two songs kind of run together, is you can tell he's like sort of using the language of like kind of self-aware psychobabble, I feel. And I have a specific example when we get there. So I just think at this point in the songwriting process, James and the other guys, I guess, since they were helping, the lyrics are goofy because they're figuring out something different that they haven't really done before. And for me, I appreciate it. I respect it. Again, I can't make fun of my lifestyle that determines my death style, because when you know that's about him being a severe alcoholic, it makes sense as a lyric.
And also, to be clear, that was a Kirk lyric. They specifically show that in the documentary. I remember that part because he says it and everybody starts laughing.
Yeah, you're right. Because I remember thinking like, oh, they cut away, but it's sort of unclear if they're laughing because it's funny.
I think they were laughing because it was funny, because they literally do start laughing.
But like they thought it was clever, I think is why they're laughing. Like they think it's like a Morrissey lyric, like a really witty pun, you know?
Well, as you mentioned earlier in the chat, there is a specific line that is a Morrissey line on this album, essentially.
Oh my God, yeah.
Oh, man. And then speaking of interesting lyrics, the next song in this album, Saint Anger, which once again is the title track, and it was the first single on this album. And essentially what I found that the song is about, it's about someone who's been living with anger all their life, and that person just wishes they could be set free from it, which is pretty plainly stated. That's what the song is about.
And the thing is, like, I don't want to get too into some emo shit. Like, these are not sentiments that I struggle to identify with, you know, various points in my life. I like a lot of the themes in this album because of that, but this is a goofy fucking song. It is very clear he's not comfortable writing about these feelings quite yet, and he gets there on the album. He does get there, in my opinion. Can I read a few lyrics from this that really stick out to me?
If you don't get to that specific lyric, I have one that I want to get to because it's hilarious, but yes, go ahead.
Well, I don't know if we have the same one. I want my anger to be healthy, and I want my anger just for me. And I need my anger not to control. Yeah, and I want my anger to be me. That's like an AA recitation. I mean, it literally is like psychobabble. And it's a nice sentiment. And it is, you know, for a guy like James, that's a guy who struggles with that sentiment. Since he's using psychobabble, I'm going to use it. That's like a breakthrough for him. It's a shitty fucking lyric for a metal band.
I mean, I will say, another thing of that is kind of like the through line of this song is the lyrics, I feel like, are made by like a boomer guy who grew up in a very like emotionally repressed household who's trying to like overcome his toxic masculinity. He's trying.
He doesn't have the vocabulary to say that. He's so far away from recognizing that. And that's what's interesting to me about this. That's why I'm trying to be fair. And I think later on in this album, I have to assume some of the later songs were written later because the lyrics express that so much more elegantly. And this is almost like he had to write this song and lay it all bare before he could learn to express it in kind of more profound ways. First of all, what does Saint Anger mean? Is the metaphor that he's a guy who's the saint of anger? Or is his name Saint Anger?
So what
this character never reappears. This isn't a rock opera.
No, that's for sure. And I think that could have been more interesting if they made it into like an EP or like a rock opera.
Well, okay, they literally could have just made it the 5 songs I like. Also.
Yeah, no. But I think it's because there's the line, you know, there's Saint Anger around my neck. And I think it's like the idea of like anger is just kind of always like presently there. Like it's just hanging on him, like either a noose or like just a sword of Damocles. Also, the line, I'm madly in anger with you is really funny.
So bad.
I fucking love it. It's so funny.
I almost disconnected my microphone because I hit it a little bit when you said that.
Yeah, I heard that was really funny because I heard it in the background. I'm like, oh my God, that was really bad. It was so bad that it made Brian's microphone go out.
No, okay, hang on. So I recited the lines that I'm more interested in because of what they represent are the psychobabble, I want my anger to be healthy, not to control.
To be fair, actually, control is more of a like theme on this album than anger is.
Well, it's control of everything. The anger is a symptom, and the alcohol is a symptom of him not being able to access his feelings. That's why this is kind of a cool album for a guy like that, because you know it was hard for him to make it, and it was hard for his friends to make it. And I'm going to say, the album, we keep saying Metallica had to make this album. It's not as good as it probably could have been, but it had to be this album for them to survive as a band. But the line, I'm madly in anger with you, let's talk about lines that are fucking bad, that you know they thought was clever when they wrote it.
Oh, no, 100%. That's a rough line for me, and they say it a lot on this song.
They say it a lot.
It's wild. Also, I will say this is probably the best music video for this album because they actually played it live at San Quentin Prison, which is a really cool thing. I mean, these guys got a free Metallica show.
Like, I'm just going to say, like, you know, it's a cool cool video. It works cool. You always think, like, there's so many problems with the American prison system. You know, prisoners are sold into slavery. They're basically tortured. They have to eat that shit. Now we're going to make them listen to Saint Anger.
Honestly, I bet they fucking loved it, though.
I bet I'm the first person to make that joke ever. No one else has made that joke.
But honestly, though, I mean, as somebody who worked in a prison, like, prisons are boring.
Of course they fucking loved it. It's fucking Metallica. These guys have probably been inside so long, they don't know Metallica aren't cool anymore.
Yeah, they're like, oh, fuck, I just listened to And Justice for All, like, just before I got in here. What the fuck are they like now?
Yeah,
and they hear him yelling, I'm madly in anger with you! And they're like, this is great.
The thing is, I do like this album. I'm going to say, like, I think it's pretty clear. We're defending this. This is a reappraisal of this album. Here's another thing. These first 2 tracks, I don't like. I don't like the first 4 tracks of this album. It was a rough start for me. At no point for me was the problem the drums. I think they sound cool. I think that little echoey ring, I think it sounds cool. I've never heard that on this kind of rock album before. I've only heard it on fucking, like, techno-industrial shit, on, like, Snog records and shit. I've never heard that on this kind of metal record. So I thought it was cool.
And then speaking of things that aren't cool, let's get into the third track here, Some Kind of Monster. Now, before I get into anything in this song, I think you and I both agreed this is the fucking worst song in the album.
It's awful.
This awful. I was wrong. It's the 3rd longest song in the album, but only by 20 seconds. It feels so fucking long. This song is 8 minutes and 25 seconds. There is no part of this song that I like. Straight up. No part of it. And it's the 3rd longest song, and it's also, once again, 8.5 fucking minutes long. This song sucks ass. I fucking hate this song.
Yeah, even if you trimmed 3 or 4 minutes off, which you'd have to make it listenable, it would still suck.
Before we get into that, the single is literally 4 minutes shorter than the title.
Of course it is.
Track.
I bet it doesn't lose anything. It probably makes perfect sense without it.
It loses nothing. Like, I've listened to both the single and the album track. It loses literally nothing.
A thing that people say about this album, one of the things we've alluded to, is that it's Metallica trying to do a new metal album. Obviously, that's true to some degree, but after listening to the album, after kind of refusing to listen to it for many years and knowing people said that about it, I feel like they weren't doing that quite as much as people say. It's mostly in the production and in, like, the emotional vulnerability, I guess. But this track, and there's other moments here where James does kind of a rap thing at, you know, it's just bad. And he is a great rock vocalist, and you're like, why are you doing this?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we talked about how bad some of the lyrics are already, but this also has literally, in my opinion, the worst lyrics on the album. The main theme is, this is the blank that blanks that blank. This is the blank that blanks blank.
This is the dick that fucks that ass.
Yeah.
These are the tits that get covered in cum.
And also there's, like, I think 2 distinct periods in the song where he literally just yells, we the people. What does that mean? It means nothing.
In the context of this song, what does that mean?
It means literally nothing. And it's interesting. So in the documentary, because it literally is, he talks about Frankenstein. They Frankenstein this track together from various parts that don't work. And they say, yeah, we're making some kind of monster.
And they think that's so good. When they say that, they look like it's so awesome.
Like, once again, I am a defender of this album, but this song fucking sucks. It's terrible. In every way, it's awful.
This is the worst one. Because so everything that I don't like about the first half of this album is all in this song. And this goes on for like 8 minutes.
Honestly, though, the one thing I will say, though, that is good about this song is it did give me the inspiration to finally come up with a theme song for this podcast, because we have not done it yet. And I'm going to do it in the style of Some Kind of Monster. So it goes a little something like this. This is the pod that really rocks. This is the pod by 2 Millennials. This is the pod where we talk about stuff. This is the pod that never ends. This is the pod we do. Millennials are old. And you repeat that like 4 times.
Do that like 40 times in a row.
That is actually better than the lyrics on this song. I'm dead ass serious.
Yeah, because it's about something.
Yeah, it actually has a purpose.
It serves a function.
Yes, goddamn. I know you mentioned this is also not a song that you like. I feel like this is the one point we may disagree with. So this next song here is Dirty Window, which is the 4th track. Now, this was not a single. This is the very first song in the album that we've been talking about that is not a single. However, interestingly enough, this is, I believe, the most recent performance of a Saint Anger song live was Dirty Window. Now, I think this is actually a fairly interesting song because it has the strongest lyrics on the album so far. Still not amazing, but stronger. You talk about clean and dirty windows. I think it's essentially about James James literally getting clean from alcohol and seeing the world
Yeah.
in a clearer vision now that he's sober. And I'll be honest, I like this song, especially the live version is really good. I think you should listen to the live version. I think you'd like it quite a bit.
Yeah, I probably should. For me, at this point in the album, I was starting to get worried. I was really burnt out after Some Kind of Monster. Here's my feeling on the first 4 songs. Basically, at this point, I didn't hate it as much as people said, but at this point, I was kind of thinking like, oh, a lot of the bad criticisms are true. I liked the drum sound. I think it's interesting. It sounds neat, but I think the production at this point was not working in favor of the songs, and they hadn't really figured out. They had a vision in their minds of what the album would sound like, but it doesn't really come together well on these first few tracks, and they kind of sound like mush to me. And so by this song, it's the 4th song in a row that's kind of like this. The lyrics are better. I have that in my notes upon the time listening to it, but I think at this point I was like, I'm 4 tracks and I need something to grab me and pull me back. Part of that might just be because I was burnt out by fucking Some Kind of Monster being 8 minutes long. I started listening to this on a Friday, a Friday for me after getting home from work, and I don't normally listen to album, take more than one sitting on an album, but after listening to Dirty Window, I became concerned that if I listened to it all that night, I would get burnt out and not judge it fairly. I did listen to the album in full in a sitting a second time after watching Some Kind of Monster to see if it changed my opinions, and it did add context. And I liked this song more, but it doesn't really hit for me at all. None of these first 4 songs I would say hit for me.
No, that's totally fair. And I will agree for the most part. Like, this is not my favorite song in the album, but I will say that this is the first song in the album, outside of certain parts of Frantic and certain parts of Saint Anger, that I will say I liked. Like, I did like pretty much this entire song. And I think, once again, the live version of this is fantastic. They really refined the song quite a bit live.
I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, I think they played this one for the very first time live. Like, I think it was either like last year or this year. Like, it was a pretty recent addition to their live set.
I mean, that's cool that they're bringing these songs back, because you can tell, like you were telling me in the notes, like this is clearly a really special album for James, and he seems to be really happy, is what you were telling me, to be playing it again and to incorporating it back.
Oh, yeah, and he even does, like, banter with the audience. Like, I think I told you, like, when they open up Saint Anger, he says, oh, this is a song from your favorite album, and he does a little smirk on his face.
That's awesome.
So I gotta love it. And then, speaking of things I love, the 5th track is Invisible Kid. Now, this is the 2nd longest song on the album. This is literally 8.5 minutes long. And this is a song that, people talked about how this is like Metallica trying to do nu metal. I think this is the first song that is like a definitive like nu metal song.
Lyrically, for sure, yeah.
So this song is about James speaking about himself, as a lot of these lyrics are very autobiographical. And they talk about it in the documentary too. He's describing this is the first time in his life that he feels like he could show off his vulnerable side. A lot of his faults, such as his ability to isolate from others, his fear of showing himself in front of others, and his fear of being judged, his low self-esteem, his thoughts being stuck in his head, not being able to vocalize them, etc. It's a song, once again, about, like, when he says invisible kid, it's like a metaphor. Like, he is a, like, child in his mind. Like, he feels like tucked away, essentially. You know what I'm trying to say? Like,
yeah, I think he talked a little bit,
like, not a literal child, but like a metaphorical child,
about throughout his life feeling kind of like he couldn't show parts of himself to people, didn't know how to connect to people in a healthy way, so he felt like he had to hide those feelings. So I'm going to tell you, I really like this song. I thought I wouldn't when I saw how long it was. I was like, oh my fucking god, not again. But this song has a really nice groove. It has some real dynamics, has a cool series of riffs. The lyrics, which I'm sure people made fun of real bad because they're so sensitive and kind of, they're some of the most nu metal-y lyrics. But I really like these lyrics. I think this is him kind of finding a way to articulate those kind of feelings. At the beginning of him articulating it in kind of a clearer way, and kind of not just being direct, but also sort of having a purpose, like a specific thing that he's trying to communicate about himself with them. But also the music really works. No solos, and it is 8 minutes long, which is, I would say in this case, probably 3 or 2 minutes too long. Still a pretty long song at 5 minutes. But I really like this song. I like the lyrics. I like the switch-offs between the bridge, the verse, and the chorus. I think it's got a little bit almost of like an arena rock or like power pop vibe. Almost kind of reminds me of the Load Reload era, where they're kind of, to me, you're kind of seeing musically a little bit of like 70s hard rock influence creep in, which is very welcome for me, a sprinkling of that in my Metallica, and never mind it. So yeah, I like this track a lot. For real, I needed this at this point, because those first 4 tracks, I was kind of like, fuck, this really is going to be as bad as people say, or it's going to be at least as daunting. And this track really made me excited again.
Yeah, you're talking about nu metal influence. Like, the lyrics are what, if Korn lyrics were made by James Hetfield, that is what this song would sound like.
And of course, James is older, so they're a little bit more restrained. They're not violent and over the top the way Corn Lyrics are, probably because he's older, you know?
Yeah, no, for sure. But yeah, no, I really like this song a lot. Once again, I agree, it is too long. But overall, like I said, this is the first song in the album that you can tell like James is finally getting into the groove of what this album is eventually going to become.
And for me, this is the first song on the album that is musically distinct, that actually has like things going on musically beyond just textures. Really is the first one that doesn't sound like mush to my ears. That sounds like a song that's fully realized.
And then speaking of songs that sound like mush, let's get into the next track here, My World, which is the first song in the album I really don't have anything to say about. I don't like this song. There's nothing interesting about it.
I don't like this one. And when I got back to this one, I thought for a moment, I was like, oh, it's possible that I'll just like Invisible Kid, and maybe that was just first of all, the lyrics are bad. Again, the phrase, it's my world, you can't have it, is bad. The chorus is bad, and it goes on forever. Like that chorus repeats a million times.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple okay riffs in here. Also, this was the song where you said there was a Morrissey lyric in here.
Yes. Let me find it. God, it feels like it only rains on me. And I was like, what is that? I mean, I like that he's exploring his sensitive side and whatever on this album. I do like that. There's parts where it's really cool, like on Invisible Kid. But that's a silly lyric to have in a Metallica song.
Yeah, I think the less we talk about this track, the better, because there's just nothing interesting to say about it. So the next song on here is Shoot Me Again. This is the 7th track. And I think the song is interesting because honestly, does this song kind of sound like a Godsmack song?
Yeah. Okay. So actually it does a little bit, but I'm going to tell you what I was thinking. It sounds kind of to me almost like an early Nickelback song. I don't think they were quite a thing yet.
Oh, no, they were, because Silver Side Up came out
Side Up had come
on September 11th. Yeah. Yeah, 9/11.
So here's the thing. I don't like this song, but it doesn't sound like mush. And I do think it's interesting. When you said the Godsmack thing, I was kind of like, because it's got the same kind of the weird macho vocalizations, which of course, Sully Erna took a lot of from James. This song has some dynamics going on. It's got like kind of cool sounding bass on it. Like it is distinct sounding, but I don't like it. It sounds kind of annoying to me. And the lyrics are very funny. They're very like tough guy kind of.
You know, talk about tough guy. I'm sure, as I told you, this song is literally about the Napster lawsuit.
Which, yeah, and it's just like not that eloquently phrased.
Shoot me again. I ain't dead yet.
Well, he's pretending to be Clint Eastwood, right? He's like, yes. You know, when No Name says, just aim for my head.
Yeah, this song's just okay. Like, I have no real issues with it, but I do think it's interesting, yeah, that it is a Nickelback and Godsmack song a little bit. It's very strange for Metallica to make a song that is more similar to them than they rip off of Metallica.
This is one of the most tough guy songs on the album. There isn't a lot of that, but I would say Shoot Me Again is the one where it's really strong there.
And then speaking of strong songs, this next song here, Sweet Amber, which is the 8th track. I fucking love this song.
Yeah, this is the best song on the album. This is a song I don't even think is necessarily overlong. I think the lyrics are really good. They've got kind of similar thing to what James had done on Load and Reload, which are a little bit more literary, a little bit more heady, I guess. It sounds really cool. So one of the weak links throughout this album is when the songs slow down and kind of get softer and kind of, I don't know, the clean parts on the guitars and stuff. But here on this track, those switches from aggression to kind of clean sounds really work. It sounds really eerie. It's a really foreboding song. This really works for me, lyrically and musically. I really feel like coming in, we're in a stretch of the album now where I start to really like it. So I'm going to say, after we pass My World, I like every track on the album. Like these last 4 tracks for me really hit, but Sweet Amber is the beginning of that run, and it's the best song on the album. It's the only song from Saint Anger that I would consider putting in my personal Metallica playlist.
I mean, that's a fucking honor, because like most people would not put any Saint Anger songs in their Metallica playlist. A lot of people wouldn't.
I think I would include Sweet. It's very, I mean, so when James sings on this and the other later tracks on the album, but a lot on this, he's really emoting when he vocalizes in a way that he hadn't for a long time. Like it feels like this means something to him, and he's not doing this weird rap sing thing. He's really singing from his full voice. And James Hetfield has a great voice for hard rock.
Agreed. He has a great voice for hard rock.
And again, a very eerie sounding song. I think it's really spooky sounding. It's cool. I like Sweet Amber a lot.
Yeah, I fucking love it. And it's a song that's interesting because it's a song that could be about addiction, but in the documentary, a lot of the lyrics, especially the line, watch your back so you won't stab mine. It's about them having to like do radio promos for this album, and they're not wanting to do that, which I totally understand. That sounds annoying as shit, especially for being arguably the most popular metal band of all time.
I think their perspective was that not wanting to do a corny promo isn't the same as refusing to play their music. Do you know what I mean? They just didn't want to be like embarrassing themselves, which they would have embarrassed themselves. I mean, I guess a lot of people would say they embarrassed themselves a lot at this time anyways. From their perspective, they're saying like, hey, just because we don't want to say like, hey, we're Metallica, listen to this radio station and, there'll be a money giveaway or whatever the fuck it was, that the station would refuse to play their music or whatever. I think they were kind of shocked by that because it seemed like, hey, we just don't want to do some goofy shit,
Yeah, no, 100%. I totally respect that.
But other than that line, I do feel like this song is pretty explicitly about addiction and temptation.
Yes.
It is, I would say, also one of the darkest sounding, probably the darkest sounding song on the album.
Yeah, there's a specific part. She holds the pen that spells the end. She traces me and draws me in. That part, especially with the instrumentation on it, is fucking fantastic.
Yeah.
That's like one of the best parts of the whole album.
I love that part. On the refrain, like the chorus is Sweet Amber, there's this really pretty, almost chorus, like backing vocal harmony on it. It just sounds really cool. I really enjoy this song.
Yeah, this is like a top 3 track for me at the very bare minimum. I love the song quite a bit. And then speaking of songs I really love, and on the 9th track now, Unnamed Feeling. So this is a song about James Hetfield's and his feelings of anxiety, depression, feelings of dread, stress, and the terrible feelings that it brings. Metaphor is obviously pretty blunt. These lyrics are very straightforward. And a lot of people consider this one of the best songs of the album. I think it's my favorite single off this album because this was actually the 3rd single released on this album, the last one being Some Kind of Monster. And honestly, this is, once again, a top 3 song. I fucking love this song. I think it's great.
This is James returning to a thing that he keeps in his pocket. He's very good at writing things that are almost ballads, but they're a little too dark and a little too heavy. Almost like country songs, not like Garth Brooks country, but like classic country. And this is almost like him in the way that this whole album sounds, doing this in that style. It's kind of a moody song. It's, a little bluesy, and it's a little bit softer, but it's still got kind of a real palpable edge to it. And so this is, I would say, as blunt as the earlier songs that I was making fun of, but I feel like lyrically now he's found a place where he can say these things and these blunt things. To me, it doesn't feel corny in the same way that, like, say, Frantic and Saint Anger do. For me, it feels more like almost like a scream therapy thing where he's laying it all bare, but it's very literal. And in this stretch of the album, he's really singing his heart out. I feel like at this point in the album, they figured out what the album is. He's figured out how he's writing and how he's singing these songs. And you can tell that he's really trying to express a part of himself that he hasn't gotten to before. And again, like musically, I think from this point on, the album works. The first half of this album is pretty rough for me. I feel like, they needed maybe to tweak those songs and maybe they didn't feel like they had time, didn't know how to. But I think after a while, they put together what the sound of this album was, and it's pretty good. And it fits into the Metallica canon pretty well, I think.
Agree. Yeah. Once again, I really like this song. And you were talking about the first half of this album, particularly Frantic and Saint Anger. I think it's really funny because Saint Anger sounds like there is a theme to it and there's like a distinct thing because they're describing a thing of Saint Anger, whatever the fuck Saint Anger is. They're at least describing something. But it's hilarious because it's vague and not particularly well defined. Unnamed Feeling is like literally sounds vague, but they're describing distinctly what it is in the lyrics.
Yeah.
Like,
it's... The feeling is very explicit.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic in a sense. But yeah, no, once again, I really like this song a lot. It's definitely my favorite single. The single is a minute and a half shorter than the album track, which is actually pretty good. I think the single does a pretty good job of encapsulating basically everything of the song without cutting away too much of it.
I'm going to say pretty much every song on this album, even, the ones that I like, except for maybe Sweet Amber, are way too long for me.
Yeah, because Sweet Amber, I think, is only a little over 5 minutes, and that's a pretty solid length.
Which is, for Metallica, is like a shorter song. So I think that's fine.
No, great. And then next song here is Purify. This is the 10th track. Now, interestingly enough, I found a lot of people online, a lot of reviewers, a lot of just general opinions, that a lot of people think this is the very worst Metallica song. And I don't think so.
Really?
That blows my mind because this is not an awful song.
No, not especially if you're comparing it to the rest of this album. So this to me is like for Metallica, it's kind of mid-tempo, but it's actually pretty fast for this album. It's kind of a foot stomper, hand clapper, live is sort of the vibe I get. It's very triumphant sounding to me. Like the impression I get is that this is sort of James writing about getting control over those emotions that he feels have controlled him. But musically, yeah, it's just, to me, it's a really solid, just hard rock song. It's really anthemic sounding. It's kind of a roof raiser.
Yeah, and obviously this song is, once again a song about addiction. And they even have the lyric, "My sweet turpentine," which obviously that's an alcohol reference. But yeah, when people say this is the worst Metallica song, I just genuinely don't know what they're talking about.
I just don't hear it. Even if you don't like this album, there are so many worse moments on this very record.
Like I said, My World and fucking Some Kind of Monster, every part of those songs are worse than the worst part of Purify.
Yeah. I mean, to me, even if you hate Saint Anger, this is one of the more inoffensive songs.
Yeah, I just don't understand why people hate it so much. I just don't understand. It makes no sense to me. Like, I don't know. But either way, yeah, I agree. I like the song quite a bit. I really like the vocal delivery because, James is just like fucking yelling the vocals on it.
And the thing with James Hetfield, you kind of forget because his voice has become sort of a parody in a lot of people's minds. He's influenced a lot of corny singers, but he is a very strong rock vocalist. He has a very strong, melodic, full sounding voice.
Oh, yeah, you want to talk about like every single butt rock band was influenced by James Hetfield's vocal delivery.
Which is unfortunate because that's not his fault.
No. And, as we need to mention, outside of maybe some people who are the most classically trained butt rock vocalists, James Hetfield is better than all of them.
Yeah.
Like, it's hilarious that butt rock vocalists, they either took inspiration from fucking Kurt Cobain, Lane Staley, or James Hetfield.
It's Lane Staley or James Hetfield. There's some combination of the two.
Yeah, and the worst butt rock bands were influenced vocally by Kurt Cobain, which is the most hilarious part. Like fucking Puddle of Mud was Wes Scantlin is very clearly trying to do Kurt Cobain.
So fucking funny. It's like he's doing Kurt Cobain blackface. Just gross.
Just gross, man. But yeah, no, totally. I think James Hetfield's a great rock vocalist, and no matter what my opinions on various Metallica songs are, I will give James credit. He's never sounded bad on a song where he's singing at the very bare minimum. Like, his singing voice is always there, regardless of the song's quality.
There are moments on this album where he sounds bad, because I think he's doing a little bit of a new metal butt rock thing. He's worried about not fitting in, and it kind of does a little bit of a rappy bah thing. It's a waste of his voice.
And without further ado, let's get into the last track here. Track 11, All Within My Hands. Now, this is also the longest track at 8 minutes and 46 seconds. This song is detailed also in the documentary, I think near the end of the documentary, where James describes his difficulty with control, as is...
And with relationships.
Exactly. Particularly interpersonal relationships. So, non-romantic, very platonic work kind of relationship.
Well, potentially also his non-work personal relationships. So, I mean, we can assume, I think, hanging over the head of this whole documentary, and I guess over this album, is that the reason Jason Newsted left is because Hetfield wouldn't allow him to take more time off to be more serious with his side project, Echo Brain. Newsted at no point, it seems like, wanted particularly to leave Metallica for Echo Brain. He just wanted to give Echo Brain a bit more time, and Metallica were less active. And James says very openly he was afraid that if he went to do something else, he would like it better than Metallica, that he would leave and not come back. And that James himself seems pretty regretful of this and pretty self-aware looking back that it wasn't necessary and that maybe he shouldn't have done it, and says, throughout his life, the way that he knows to love things is to hold them down and to say, like, no, you can't go, you need to be here. It's a pretty scary sentiment, but a thing that I think a lot of people can experience. And I gotta say, lyrically, I think this is the best song on the album.
Agreed. These are some great fucking lyrics.
So the thing is, when I said earlier, I think James Hetfield has written some great lyrics, and I do think there's a literary quality to a good amount of what he writes. His best lyrics are very direct, and this is this is a very direct song about very unpleasant feelings. But I think someone writing a song like this, it's so self-aware. He's got such an awareness that maybe he didn't have a few years ago in writing this, that it feels like a confrontation. It's also why the length of this track doesn't bother me quite so much as with the others, is because there is a real build to this song. There are peaks and valleys, like in some of the classic Metallica longer songs. So the length of it really does feel like a climax to the album to me, instead of just 8 minutes for 8 minutes' sake, like Some Kind of Monster.
No, yeah, for sure. I think this is a great song. Yeah, once again, I think the lyrics are great. I mean, some highlights here I have is all within my hands, hold it dear, hold it, suffocate. I mean, that's essentially the sentiment. Like, he's trying to hold things just together so much and control it so much that he ends up suffocating it.
Yeah,
that's like he's pushing people away, in a literal sense.
Well, that's the thing that I don't know if this song probably hadn't been written yet. Jason Newsted says pretty explicitly that's what happened to him. At one point, Lars says, and I kind of think Lars might have been being a little bit more manipulative and maybe didn't have much fear that this would happen, but says, I don't want to end up like Jason while him and James are disagreeing. I kind of feel like Lars was saying that when there was probably not much chance, I think, of Lars leaving the band, to be honest. But I think maybe he was saying that to kind of throw it in James's face. But I don't know the guys. No, the back half of this album fucking slaps. I think it's a really fucking good Metallica record. In the second half, I really feel like it's got a distinct sound. I feel like James's songwriting and his vocals and his lyrics all have come together to do something really different from anything he's done before. Like I said, I like the drum sound. I like the clanging. I don't give a fuck. I think it's interesting sounding to me. The thing is, it seems like most critics of this album, they don't really hear this second half for what it is. Right. They make their judgments, I think, based on the first 3 songs or so, and then they kind of stop listening to it, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree. In fact, so we're both fans of the POD cast, and
I didn't even want to talk about him.
I know, but we do have to mention it. Whereas Brian, not this Brian, the Shadow the Hedgehog version of Brian Quimby, says that the second half of this album is much worse than the first half. And I don't know what
I just don't understand
smoking. You know what I think it is, and I think I told you this, is he already came into the album with the idea of not liking it. He said he's always hated this album. And I think for him, the more he had to listen to, the more of it he hated.
Which is fine. By the way, I don't like the first half of this album. And also, one of the big differences between me and Brian is that he's significantly older than I am. So he's coming from a different cultural background. Like, he didn't grow up online the way he did, so he's maybe not as much of a spaz about shit as I am. I think his take, probably a lot of people's take, is if I don't like something right away, why the fuck would I try to like it? By the way, that's valid. That's not really how I listen to music, because I have fucking, like, music Asperger's or whatever, and I listen to the same thing over and over. I get why people don't like this album, because like I said, I think the first half of this album bummed me out. Just because I was like, oh, this is not really that interesting. It wasn't really till we got to Invisible Kid, and I was like, all right, something happened in here. And then there were a couple more tracks I didn't really like. And then these last 4 tracks, I'm like, no, these are good Metallica songs. They're doing something different, and they're still being Metallica. I do not understand the idea of thinking that the back half is worse than the first half. The first half is so clearly inferior, and they so clearly got better as they worked on the album. And it seems like they did it in sequence.
Honestly, if like the first half was the second half and then they made more songs, you know what I mean, to like fill out what could have been a back half, like this would have been a really fucking amazing album.
I think so. I am going to say, so if I'm being honest, because again, I've been re-listening even before we decided to do our Metallica series, because listeners, I'm just going to warn you, this is only the first half of a Millennials, our old project. I was already listening to a lot of classic Metallica this month. I'm listening to a lot of Suicidal Tendencies, a lot of Body Count, a lot of Megadeth, a lot of Metallica, all that shit. And when I listen to those old Metallica, when I listen to Ride the Lightning and Kill 'Em All, Master of the Puppets, I do think like, oh, this is way better than anything I'm saying to Anchor. So I do like this album. There is a thing where when I listened to this for a while in preparation for the podcast, I was like, oh, this back half is great. But then when I compare it to the Metallica that I've revisited and I know like the back of my hand and I love, yeah, I really am like, oh, it's not as good as this. You know, they're 20 years older.
Yeah. Also, the one thing I did want to mention that I forgot to mention all in my hands. So, interestingly enough, Metallica has a charity and it gives scholarships and kids to make their art projects and stuff like that or whatever, right? And it is called All Within My Hands. That's the name of their charity. And also, I do want to mention, apparently this is a kind of infamous lyric, but it's only infamous if you don't actually pay attention to what the lyrics are about, because All Within My Hands is about somebody whose need to control is so dominant that will push people away and like metaphorically kill whatever positive relationship they have. At the very end of the song, there's like a breakdown, a pretty heavy breakdown, especially for like Metallica, where James just yells, kill, kill, kill.
Yeah, I love that. I think that fucking rules.
I love it. And you know what's wild to me is, you know, talk about other people's opinions on this album. So Todd and the Shadows train records about this album. And to be fair, this album did kind of destroy Metallica's like commercial viability to a certain extent.
To an extent, but I mean, they were always going to be Metallica. I'm sorry, I don't really buy that narrative as much as people say that. I mean, it's kind of true, but they're Metallica. Yeah.
But by the time he got to All Within My Hands, he literally was like, I'm not listening to this. I'm done listening to this album. I hate this album.
That's a stupid way to review an album.
It is, 100%. He saw the length of the song and he's like, nah, fuck this. I'm done. He didn't even review it.
That sucks.
Especially considering, once again, this is one of the best songs on the album.
Well, it is. So I'm going to say people are going to laugh at me for this. You know what? There are some parallels between this album and our Plastic Ono Band by John Lennon or The Final Cut by Roger Waters with Pink Floyd. So Plastic Ono Band was literally inspired by John's sessions into like primal scream therapy, incorporating primal screaming into rock and roll and like kind of writing rock and roll songs about the emotions that he learned to articulate through scream therapy. Final Cut came out about 10 years later, and it's, 1983, I think, and it's Roger Waters doing this minimal piece that's all about him talking about the trauma of growing up without a dad because his father died in World War II. And they're just very brazen, very direct songs about like male pain. And from that lens, this being like a guy who is toxically masculine, who doesn't really have the vocabulary to express that and is trying to learn it, I wanted to say, like, all within my hands, the idea that, like, the only way that you know or are comfortable showing love is by controlling and holding on to something so tight that you end up pushing it away. I mean, that's pretty heavy stuff. It's hard for me to look at that. Like, I'll make fun of my lifestyle determines my death style. God, it feels like it only rains on me. I don't have anything to make fun of in All Within My Hands. Like, these are good lyrics and these are very real lyrics, and they're pretty tough to listen to. And again, the album ends on James chanting kill, 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 kill over and over. And again, the context for this is that he is afraid that he will kill every good relationship he has. I think this is a really kind of amazing song.
Agreed, 100%. And it's just a great way to end the album, Saint Anger. It's just a great way to end it.
The silly way would be maybe to end it, and I think Purify is the uplifting song, so there is a song like that. But the obvious way to end it would be with like a hopeful, nice song. But that isn't really how that process works.
Yeah, it ends with a fucking muddy-ass fucking dirty breakdown where James just screams, kill, kill, kill. Like, I mean, it's just perfect way to end it. And yeah, speaking of, man, that's fucking Saint Anger. I will always be a defender of this album. Like, 100%, if you're a Metallica fan, I think you owe it to yourself to at least give this album like a genuine chance. Just a chance. And I think you'll like some of the songs on here.
There are some good songs on here. And it's, again, Metallica had to make this album. And if it wasn't this album, it wouldn't have worked.
No, I agree.
This is the album they had to make to get through that period in their relationship.
And the album in the documentary is a ugly therapy session.
So do you think we should hit on some stuff in the doc?
Oh, yes. So a lot of the most riveting scenes in the documentary are like the various therapy scenes to me. And especially, you know, we mentioned it earlier. We got to talk about it. The fucking Dave Mustaine and Lars Ulrich portion of the movie. Oh, my God. Dave Mustaine is insufferable in this movie.
And I'm going to throw this out. Let's start with this. Megadeth were a more important band to me in my youth than Metallica. I felt a closer connection to Mustaine's music and to his lyrics and to his voice. I like his voice. I think he has a cool, weird, kind of punky voice. He is insufferable in this. And I'm going to say it's him and Lars talking basically for the first time since James and Lars kicked Dave out of Metallica. He is talking like an abusive boyfriend trying to get back together with his ex.
I mean, it makes sense. Dave Mustaine is a fucking crank narcissist.
He sounds like a fucking psycho in this scene.
Yeah, it's awful. And I think you mentioned it too. He's like, well, you know, fucking kicked me out, blah, blah. And it's like, well, you got kicked out because you were a junkie.
Yeah, this pissed me off. It was like, and then, you know, to see Kirk and to hear everyone say how good he is and to feel like I wasn't good enough for Metallica. It's like nobody in the world ever said you weren't a good enough guitarist for Metallica. You got kicked out because you were a fucking snackhead and you lied and stole.
Yeah, no one has ever said Dave Mustaine was a bad guitarist.
No
one's ever said that.
Yeah, of all the things people have said about Dave Mustaine, nobody's ever said that.
Yeah, no one has ever been like, you know what? Dave Mustaine's a cool guy, but man, his work on Metallica was dog shit. It was
he really thinks about his position on global politics, but boy, he really should practice his scales.
You know, I really like Risk, but I hate every single song he has a credit for on Kill 'Em All. Those songs sucked. Nobody has ever said that.
Yeah, no. There's actually a huge contingency of Metallic fans that semi-ironically like to put out the notion that he actually wrote all of the music on Kill 'Em All.
Which is objectively not true.
That's not true. It's just not. And I'm going to say something. James Hetfield made the song Mechanics better when he made it into Four Horsemen. Did you know those started as the same song? So Mechanics by Megadeth began as a Metallica song that they all wrote together. Megadeth did Mechanics, which is a kind of sophomoric sex song about the mechanics of sex. Whereas Four Horsemen is this kind of political song about organized religion and invoking, like, you know, the Four Horsemen, and this particularly famine as like a political Reagan era thing. Yeah. So kind of what that song started as. I mean, James did build it into something much grander.
But yeah, no, Dave Mustaine sucks in this movie. I do like the scenes with Jason. I totally understand his perspective. I respect him a lot. I think that he made a very brave decision on leaving Metallica. He did it for his like own sanity and artistic ability. I mean, you know, the thing is, he was the bassist in Metallica's most successful commercial period. He will always have money. He doesn't need money. And he basically says it himself. Like, what matters to him is more freedom. And, you know, post-Metallica, he was in fucking Voivod. He was in Ozzy Osbourne's band. You know, he did fucking Echo Brain. Like, I could tell he's just a happy guy just chilling out, just making whatever fucking music he wants to make at this
And
point.
That's the thing to reiterate. He didn't leave Metallica to do Echo Brain. He left because James forbid him from doing more with Echo Brain.
Yeah.
You know, that's an important distinction. It's
It
a
is a
subtle
very
distinction,
important
but it's important. We talked about Dave Mustaine. I think we should talk about one more psychopath, coat rider, kind of.
Are we talking about the therapist?
Narcissist. Yeah, let's talk about that creep.
Yeah, that fucking weird guy who essentially, he's like the Yoko Ono of this documentary.
Oh my God, he's so much worse than Yoko. So they say themselves, the label is bringing in a therapist who works with baseball teams and things to make people that don't get along work together productively so everyone else can keep making money off of them. So they don't entirely trust this therapist, and they go along with him, and everyone in Metallica seems aware that they do need some sort of intervention, you know, some sort of help. So they work with this guy, and I think Lars is the one who said that in the beginning, just said it. This guy's job isn't necessarily to make everyone in Metallica super healthy and get along. It's to make sure they continue to make money for the label. That is why they've hired him. Here's the deal with this guy. It's just basic therapy stuff that probably he's just guiding the guys in Metallica through these conversations that they don't have the tools to have themselves yet. But eventually he's in the studio with them, and he's like kind of making weird suggestions about songs and things. And they're kind of getting better. This is towards the end of the movie. This is one of my favorite parts because I never liked this guy. Just a creep, you know?
Yeah, he's a weird guy.
So their relationships in Metallica, the band's relationships are getting better, and it seems like the album's coming together. And this guy, this fucking therapist, first of all, at one point, he says, I think we've had a lot of productivity lately today. And they're sort of like, what do you mean, like, in terms of therapy or in terms of the album? Like, it's kind of weird. Like, he's seeing himself as being part of the album making process. And you can tell they're kind of weirded out by that. He puts all these weird signs around their practice area, like, I guess, motivational signs without telling them. And then when the band say, hey, we don't really want these signs where we're playing, you know, we don't like this, he kind of goes like, well, I would appreciate if you talk to me about it instead of taking them down. Like, dude, you're their fucking client. After he puts the signs up, they start having private band meetings without the therapist there. Because again, their relationships seem to have improved at this point. And say, this guy's getting too attached. He's starting to like get the impression that he's in the band. We got to talk to him. So James, I think, sits down to talk to him, right? And as he's trying to say, we appreciate what you've done and we need to start, you know, working with ourselves. But before James can get to that, the therapist goes like, I have this vision of me going on the road with you, doing individual performance therapy with all four of you to help you really develop as you're on tour. And James is just like, hey, thank you, but it's done. And the guy is so mad about it.
Doesn't even talk about like, well, I was thinking about buying a house around here.
The thing where like James has this meeting with him, because this is the meeting where now that they feel like they're better, James is about to have to say like, hey, we need to pump the brakes on this. Maybe you come on the road with us for a couple weeks and see how it goes, and I can talk to you about things, and then we have to be off on our own. And before James can get to that, it's like the guy he's like, oh, me and my family, I want to buy a house so that we can be on the Bay Area with Metallica. I hate that fucking guy. He, to the degree that any professional psychologist probably would have helped them, it seems like did help them, but he was very unprofessional, to say the least.
Very unprofessional, 100%. I'm glad you mentioned that guy, because that guy did give me the creeps throughout a lot of this movie, for sure. And also, one thing that did not give me the creeps, and I do want to mention this, because this was near the end of the doc. Of course, we've talked a little bit about Robert, but I love the audition scenes where they have the auditions for the various bases, and they have fans come in and do a couple little fun fuck-off performances, and there's, you know, one girl who's doing a really good job, and she gets to play like Seek and Destroy with fucking Metallica and stuff, and it's really cool. And also, one thing I forgot to mention about Invisible Kid, the riff before the lyrics kick in on Invisible Kid is just literally the new metal version of the Seek and Destroy riff.
It is. After you said that, you sent it to me today, and I listened to them back to back, and I was like, fuck, you're right, it totally is.
It's really funny. But so they show off various members of various bands that are performing with Metallica and audition with them. One of them is fucking Twiggy Ramirez. One of them is Pepper Keenan, the bassist for Kiss, that's it. And then there's the bassist of The Cult. Like a lot of very prominent musicians at the time.
All excellent bass players.
Exactly. And once again, out of all of them, I do think Robert is a fantastic fit for Metallica. And even then, when they start playing, they're like, oh my God, this guy's just like a reincarnation of like Cliff to us. Like he's just...
So Robert Trujillo, I can never say his last name. Can't do that with my tongue.
I think Trujillo. Yeah, I think that's it, right?
But he is, for my money, the best pure musician, except for maybe Mustaine, to ever play with Metallica.
I will agree with that, yes.
There's a part where he says, you know, they're talking about what to play, and he says he wants to play, is it Hit the Lights? It's something from Kill 'Em All.
I think it is Hit the Lights, I believe.
And Lars says, or James says, one of them go, you can play that with your fingers? And he goes, oh yeah. Because of course he makes his bones playing in Suicidal Tendencies, you know. Like such a fast band. It's a band that makes Metallica seem slow.
Yeah, exactly. And I also love, and obviously they had to show this to a certain extent, but they're like, listen, we like you so much, we will literally offer you $1 million just to join us right now. And you can see Robert's look. I mean, of course, he played in Suicidal Tendencies, he played in Ozzy Osbourne. Like, he's a guy that's been around the bends, but he's like, you're literally going to give me $1 million just to say yes. And he looks like he's about to cry. Like, it's a beautiful scene. It made me really happy watching those scenes because I'm like, oh man, he's finally gotten like his big break.
The thing is that for him to do that, I mean, obviously he was going to say, yeah, you'd be a fool not to. That did mean downplaying Infectious Grooves and Suicidal for a while. And he's a big part of those bands. That was a huge part of his life, but obviously joining Metallica, and he had the chops for it. One of the things I think that James says when they're interviewing bassists, it's important to have someone who is kind of their age. So as much as we all say, like, people like to say, oh, they're trying to be a new metal band, I really don't know if they were that much. I think they were trying to adapt, but they still sound like Metallica at every point. I mean, okay, I want to say the production is murky. He does a little bit of that rap talk. They are mostly playing what I would call thrash on this album still, more than like new metal.
Oh, yeah, I agree. Like, there's only a couple, like, objective new metal songs. Like, I still think, like, Invisible Kid is probably the most new metal song in the album.
Oh, yeah.
But overall, I would say it's more thrash than new metal by quite a bit.
I think it's mostly, for me, it's in the production, and then I guess in the lyrical content, in how stark it is.
Agreed. But yeah, there's some great moments from the documentary. Once again, Some Kind of Monster. It's a great documentary. If you like this album, or at least are interested in this album, I think you should also watch the documentary.
It's an essential companion piece to this, I think, if you want to do a serious investigation of it. I would also say, if you like rock documentaries, that's a great documentary. It's very well made. It's very interesting. Whether you like Metallica, don't like them, whatever, like the album, don't like it, it's just good. It's just a good rock band documentary.
So yes, without further ado here, I think we should get into the Amazon reviews. Now, I only have one Amazon review here because this album, even though it has a lot of reviews on Amazon, and a lot of them are pretty good, some of them are really bad, a lot of the positive reviews kind of echoed a lot of the sentiments that we had talked about, the fact that James is trying to come into his own of like trying to overcome his toxic masculinity on these vocals to a certain extent. They get better as the songs go along. A lot of the positive reviews liked the murky production. They think it added a lot of ambience to it. And they also have some of the criticisms like no guitar solo. So basically a lot of the positive reviews said exactly the same stuff we did. So I don't want to keep going over that. However, I have one negative review here, say 1-star review, and I want to mention it because this review, I think, encapsulates what this album is to Metallica fans very succinctly, and it's very short. And it's also one of the higher upvoted reviews on Amazon as well. So it's kind of the perfect like amalgamation of everything. So Daniel Starr gives this album 1 star, and the head of the review says, the Patriot Saint of Anger. And the body of the review says, Saint Anger is the Jar Jar Binks of metal albums. Now, I think this is getting to the idea of what this album is to Metallica fans. Saint Anger to Metallica fans is the Phantom Menace to Star Wars fans. It is a perfect analog for this album. I'm being serious. And so you've not seen The Phantom Menace, right?
Not since it came out when I was a little kid.
So The Phantom Menace was also, just like Saint Anger, it was a movie that was hyped up to hell, so much product placement. I mean, unbelievable amount of product placement came out for The Phantom Menace. Like,
wait, there's product placement in The Phantom Menace? You mean advertising? Like there were costing and promotions. You don't mean product placement.
No, you're
like
totally
Guado eating Fritos.
Yeah. I mean, I think there was a commercial with that at one point. But no, you're right. There's a lot of advertisement for this, yes. Like, the vending machine in my elementary school was a Phantom Menace fucking Pepsi machine. Like, it was everywhere.
I mean, they had to know that was going to be dated soon.
Yeah, exactly, right? Jesus Christ. But yeah, no. So much advertisement for this movie. Crazy. At this point, just like Metallica, George Lucas was having a bit of a stump with fans. They were having that whole no original release of A New Hope. People were kind of mad that it just took so long for a new Star Wars property to come out. And people were really excited for it. People had all these hopes and expectations for this movie, just like they did with Saint Anger. And then when the movie came out, everybody was like, oh my God, this is not what I expected.
They had new hope, and then they struck back.
And then there was an almost immediate fan backlash, just like that movie and this album. They both had pretty middling critical receptions. And for the most part, you either liked it or you hated it. So there's that similarity to it as well. And then on the top of it, like, I think there's been a reappraisal for both of these properties in the last couple of years. So like,
come on.
No, I'm serious. Like, honestly, The Phantom Menace is not a great movie. I will fully admit that. However, there's some things I like about The Phantom Menace. I think that even though it is a boring movie, I actually kind of like the aesthetics of the prequels quite a bit. I think they have a very like operatic sort of Shakespearean quality to them.
If you said that about episode 2 or 3, I like, at least in theory, seeing Anakin, how he became the bad guy of the universe, Phantom Menace, I don't know.
I totally agree. I like Saint Anger more as a Metallica album than I like Phantom Menace as a Star Wars movie. I will say that. The similarity isn't obviously one-on-one, but I think to Metallica fans, they think of it as the Phantom Menace of Metallica albums. Like, I really do think that. And hilariously enough now, I think the most recent one was The Last Jedi or whatever the fuck it was called. Like, people hate that movie. I would say those people hate that movie more than they hate fucking Phantom Menace now. That's really
because they feel let down by it.
No, 100%. So even though it's obviously not a perfect comparison, I would say to Metallica fans, once again, Saint Anger is the Phantom Menace of Metallica albums for Metallica fans. Oh, by the way, and we will never review the Phantom Menace. I'm being serious. Unlike this album, where there's a lot to say that people have not said about this album, and I think we've said a lot about this album that I think almost nobody else has ever said, to be honest with you, because I've seen a lot of reviews and a lot of videos, and very few of them, if any of them, said any of the shit we were saying. So
that's nice. That's cool.
And I'm happy about that fucking too. But with the Phantom Menace, there is nothing. Everything that has ever been said about Phantom Menace has already been said.
I just don't really have any interest. Like, this, I think, is a good album for the Millennials, our old kind of library, because it gets into, like, it existed in a place in time and it was defined by that place in time. And I think now that time's passed, we can look back at it now that we're old Millennials and we can say, like, what is this album? How does it reflect the times it came out? And does it make more or less sense now? I don't know if I have that for Phantom Menace in the same way.
I agree. But that was the one Amazon review I wanted to have because I think it encapsulates exactly what it is to Metallica fans, the diehard Metallica fans, the I don't listen to anything after And Justice Metallica fan.
For a long time, in some ways, that was me. Not because I was a diehard fan, but because I liked those albums and I kind of felt like I didn't want to sully them. Although, you know what? I really like some songs. Of course, we said there's some bangers on the Black Album and also on Load. Reload is a little much. Could have kept it to one album, probably.
No, I agree. Yeah, I think there's some good songs on all those albums that you mentioned, too. It's one of those things where if you're a Metallica fan and you literally don't think they made anything good after And Justice, I don't know what to tell you. They've definitely made good stuff after And Justice. I mean, there's bangers on pretty much every Metallica album. I'll listen to 72 Seasons one of these days.
So here's the deal. Nothing for me comes close to 80s Metallica that they've done since. Like, just nothing comes close to the heights of that for me.
Oh, yeah. Totally.
But also, I'm not such a big fan that I feel so disappointed by the later stuff. Do you know what I mean? There are people maybe who are bigger Metallica fans of those classic albums than I am, so they like have to rail against the later stuff. I don't really have that. And I'm going to say, especially this album, but especially when you know the backstory of this album, you get the context from the documentary, it's a pretty uplifting documentary to me. And then when you were telling me about how, you know, James, you can tell that it means a lot to him that the album is getting reappraised and that he says things like, oh, here's a song from your favorite album, and then kicks into something from this record. I mean, that makes me feel pretty good. That's a nice story to me. That's a nice resolution.
Agreed.
They're a deeply important band. I listened to some Metallica in middle school, bonded over them during my classic rock nerd phase with my dad, got real into those 80s Metallica and the other 80s thrash bands when I was into punk and hardcore. Just easy commonality there. And now those early Metallica albums, they're just part of a thing that I revisit, you know, a few times a year. The guys in the band, you know what? They went through this weird period. They had to make this record, and they made it, and they came out on the other side. And they seem pretty cool with what they are. They seem all right with what they are at this point in history.
Absolutely. Their status is very much cemented. And I will say, speaking of, final thoughts here, because I'm definitely getting old and we need to end things fairly soon. We've talked about this album quite a bit. My final thoughts here. I think you should give this album a chance, give the documentary a chance, and I would recommend going to your nearest Best Buy and buying both the album and the documentary, paying full price, no sales, full price. You will appreciate it.
Still around?
There are a couple Best Buys near me. Yeah. But yes, definitely buy this from your local Tower Records.
So, final thoughts. Okay, if you're a Metallica fan, try to listen to this album. Just listen to it for what it is. And I would say watch the documentary. Even if you don't like this album, watch the documentary because it's very insightful. I think there are some good later day Metallica songs on it. Well, now it's not even later day. Again, like if you don't like anything after And Justice, that's fine. And I even get it to a degree, and then maybe don't bother. But you know what? I think that for a lot of people, if you come into this with time having kind of softened the blow of things people didn't like about this album, you come in, you accept that the drums sound the way they do. You accept that it's got a new metal production. At its core, especially the second half, there's some good Metallica songs on it, I think.
I couldn't agree more. And with all that, this will be Taylor signing off here. You can follow me at Carlos Chantor on X.com, not X videos. That's a different site that I'm on. But yes, you can follow me at Carlos Chantor on Twitter.com.
Brian. Follow me at JONSTABB, JohnStab at Twitter.com. Sort of say, again, this is only the first half of a bad Metallica deep dive. This is an album Taylor had listened to a lot that I had never listened to. Next episode, we will be listening to the other worst Metallica album ever that I chose, that I've listened to, that Taylor has not yet. Another album that I would say I have strange feelings about and has a strange history. Will probably also be a long episode, but should be a fun one. I'm sure everyone knows what we're talking about right now. I Am the Table. I would cut my legs and tits off to be like Boris Karloff, etc.
And you know what? Unlike Saint Anger, which has gotten a bit of a reappraisal, this one has not yet, and maybe we'll be the very first ones to start that trend.
I was arguing in sympathy for this album since it came out. I was one of the very small number of people that bought the physical copy of Lulu the week it came out. Something like 13,000 people in the US or something. One of those was me, baby.
It's so funny. All right, so yep, everybody, stay tuned for that. Lulu, we love it. Rest in peace, Lou Reed, friend of the pod.
One of the best to do it.
All right, fuck. Have a good night, everybody. Stay tuned for Lulu.